I was deep in Washington state, backpacking through the national parks. By the second day, I had already trekked about 20 miles from the nearest road and hadn't come across another soul. The air was crisp with the early signs of fall, but I had all the gear I needed to stay comfortable. That morning, I brewed a quick cup of coffee over my pocket stove before setting out for my next campsite, which was about 6 miles ahead. The trail was rugged, winding through the mountainous terrain, and about 4 hours into my hike, I heard something unusual: footsteps ahead. Looking up, I saw a man heading toward me, moving in the opposite direction. It was unexpected, but I nodded in acknowledgement as he passed. That's when I noticed something strange. He wasn't carrying anything. No backpack, no water, nothing. Just a long-sleeved shirt and worn-out hiking pants. My curiosity got the better of me, and I turned for another glance, only to find him doing the same. To avoid making things awkward, I quickly looked away and continued on my path, eventually pushing the encounter to the back of my mind. Several grueling hours later, I arrived at my campsite. It was more secluded than I had expected, with trees obscuring most of the view. Despite the disappointing location, exhaustion won out. I set up my tent and settled in to watch the sunset. Then I heard it, a rustling sound behind me. Turning around, my heart nearly stopped. It was him. The same man from earlier. He still had no gear, no supplies, nothing. But now, he was here. The problem? He had been walking in the opposite direction when we first crossed paths. For him to arrive at my campsite, he must have turned around almost immediately after passing me. Without a word or a glance in my direction, he walked to the far edge of the campsite and sat down on the ground. No tent. No sleeping bag. Just sitting there, staring into the darkening forest. A deep unease settled over me. This wasn't normal. Who was this guy? Why was he so far into the wilderness with nothing? My instincts screamed at me to leave, so I started packing my tent. That's when he turned his head. His eyes locked onto me, unblinking. He never looked away. As I stuffed my gear into my pack, he rose to his feet. I bolted. I could hear his footsteps behind me, keeping pace, growing closer. My fingers tightened around the small knife in my pocket. After a minute, I risked a glance back. He was still following but falling behind. Then I made a desperate move. I veered off the trail, diving into the dense forest. The darkness was thick, but I crouched behind a tree, holding my breath. Seconds later, his footsteps reached where I had left the trail. Then they stopped. Silence. And then he spoke, his voice eerily friendly, calling out as if we were old friends. The tone made my skin crawl. He called my name, though I had never told him what it was. Then, without warning, he stopped speaking and walked straight into the woods, disappearing into the blackness. I stayed hidden for over an hour before forcing myself to move. I hiked through the night, skipping my next campsite, only stopping when I reached civilization. I reported the encounter to the local authorities, but they never followed up. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he wanted. All I know is that I'm lucky I never had to find out. A couple of years ago, I decided to try camping for the first time. I had zero experience, but I figured the only way to learn was to jump in. I picked a campsite, a couple of hours from my city, secluded enough to feel like an adventure, but still populated enough that I wouldn't be completely alone. I arrived around noon, hiked for a few hours, and eventually reached the campground. It had a communal area with benches and grills, with smaller trails leading to more private campsites. I chose one, set up my tent, and by the time I finished, a few people had gathered in the main area, chatting and cooking. Not being the most social guy, I kept to myself until one of them, a guy named TJ, came over and invited me to join them. He was around my age, mid to late 20s, and seemed friendly, so I went along. The group was welcoming, and I hung around for a bit before heading back to my tent, as the sun started to set. About an hour later, TJ showed up at my tent. He asked if I had ever been to this campsite before. I said no. Then, he asked if I knew about a hidden lake nearby. Again, I said no. His face lit up. "Dude, you have to see it. No one knows about it. It's amazing." I was intrigued, and he seemed genuine. So, without much thought, I grabbed my things and followed him. He led me down a narrow, barely used path through the trees, claiming it was only a 10-minute walk. 10 minutes passed. No lake. TJ, who had been chatty before, suddenly became quiet, responding to my questions with one-word answers. More unsettling, he kept glancing at the sky, watching as the last slivers of sunlight faded through the trees. Something in me shifted. A warning bell in my head told me to stop walking. After another few minutes, I subtly slowed my pace, creating some distance between us. Then, without warning, I turned and ran. "Hey!" TJ called, his voice still light-hearted at first, then it turned sharp. Angry. I heard him running after me. Adrenaline surged through my body. I weaved through the trees, heart pounding, trying to remember the way back. Then I heard it, a metallic clang behind me. Glancing back, I saw a knife bounce off a tree just feet from where I had been. TJ had thrown it. I ran harder, and eventually, I burst into the campsite, gasping for breath. When I told the others what happened, one of them called the police. But TJ, if that was even his real name, was already gone. And after searching, no one could find his tent. He had never planned to stay. He had been waiting, watching, choosing a target. That target had been me. Last year, I spent a few weeks in Montana, living out of the camper in the back of my truck. Most nights, I stayed at campgrounds or public land. On my last night, I was behind schedule, so I found a remote spot off the highway to park. The area was empty. I settled in for the night, but just as I laid down, headlights beamed through my window. A rusted truck pulled up, stopping at the entrance to my campsite. Instead of turning around or leaving, it just sat there. Something felt wrong. Minutes passed. Then, a door opened. 2 men stepped out, silhouetted against the headlights. They walked toward my camper, one of them holding something heavy. A crowbar. "Hey, buddy," one of them called, voice slurred. "We need some directions. Mind opening up?" I didn't move. Then, the other one scraped the metal against my door, pressing into it. Testing it. My heart pounded. Then a gunshot echoed through the woods. Not from them. From somewhere out in the darkness. The men froze. Without hesitation, they bolted back to their truck and sped off. I never saw who fired that shot. But I do know that, without it, I might not be here to tell this story.